All right, so everyone's talking about how challenging the upcoming couple of years are going to be from a budget perspective, and that means you need to take control of how dollars flow out of your organization. So, how do you do that? Well, it starts with the data, and specifically data on how, where, when, and with what frequency purchases are being made all across your various departments. You may or may not have a procure to pay platform that makes it easy to measure this type of activity. But to get you inspired, you should go check out Procurify's brand new Charter School Benchmark Report. It just came out a couple weeks ago and offers 10 procurement benchmarks from charter schools across the country, highlighting things like average PO volumes, spend per vendor, items per vendor, how long it takes to go from requisition to PO, and so on. Not only will you be intrigued to answer these same questions for your school, it might also shine a light on opportunities for cost control next year. You can go to procurify.com/resources to download a copy or check out the episode description, and we've linked to it there as well. All right, now back to the show.
And so knowing that ESSER allowed for that and knowing that was an existing cost for our schools, that's something we included if we could. That includes custodial staff. That includes if you have a third-party custodial vendor. So if you use QuickBooks Online, for example, you can look back at your historical spending over the last year and you can kind of estimate, oh, hey, we used ABC Clean Company and they were about $12,000 a month. Let's put $12,000 a month in our grant budget and help absorb some of that cost that we know we're going to have regardless.
Welcome to Charter School Insider, lessons from the nation's top charter school operators, the only podcast dedicated to the behind-the-scenes business of running a successful charter school. Join us as we sit down with charter school leaders who share how they are overcoming the biggest operational hurdles facing their schools today.
All right, everyone. My guest today is Kim Tarin. Kim began her professional career in banking with Old National Bank, and after pursuing that career initially, she pivoted to get into education. She taught kindergarten for 3 years at local charter schools in Indianapolis, completing her service with Teach for America in 2016. After that, she helped launch a local IPS innovation charter school in 2017, serving as the business operations manager. Kim now serves today as the director of grant services and client support for CIES. CIES supports over 20 charter schools through grant and financial services, allowing schools to focus on what matters most. Kim has a bachelor's degree in organizational management from Bethel College. She also graduated with an MBA from Indiana Wesleyan University and also has a master's degree from Marian University in teaching. She was born and raised in South Bend, Indiana, and today she resides in Westfield with her husband, Justin, and her son, Leo. In today's conversation, Kim and I discuss grant management, something she works with charter schools on each and every day. And Kim lays out a really practical and tactical framework for managing grants throughout the year. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Kim, thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited for our conversation today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Whenever we have someone on who is not currently working in a school, I always find a little additional background is helpful. And so I would love if you could kick us off with just sharing a little bit about your personal background, but also about CIES, because for those that don't live or work at a charter school in Indiana, they may not have heard of CIES. So I wanted to start there before we jump into our topic.
Yeah, it feels like a long time ago when I graduated with my undergrad. I worked in banking for quite a few years and served, several different positions throughout the bank. From there, I decided to get my MBA, and then I moved to Indianapolis to live somewhere else. I'm originally from South Bend. And so, while I was in Indy, I decided I wanted to be a teacher and fulfill that dream. And so I applied to Teach for America, and I was able to be placed in Indy. So I taught kindergarten for about 2.5 years. And then from there, my school leaders at the time knew of my background in business and asked me to be an operations manager for a new innovation charter school. And so I served in that role for about 1.5 years, helped start a new school, which I feel like comes with all of there's so much involved in that. And so I learned a lot. And after I was there for about 1.5 years, I was offered the role that I'm in now at CIES, and been at CIES for about 5 years, going on 6 years. CIES stands for Center for Innovative Education Solutions. So now you know why we say CIES instead of...
It's a little long. It's a little long.
It's a little bit long. But basically, we started out as a nonprofit organization that honestly, we just wanted to start helping schools with back office support regarding finance and operations. And we really truly didn't know what the organization was fully going to look like. But at CIES, we say on the business services side is mainly the side that I work on. And so our whole goal is to make sure that school leaders, operations staff, finance teams, everybody that's really all hands on deck at the school level is able to do their job, do it well, and not have to worry as much about all of the things that go on in the background when it comes to finance and grants at schools. So we mainly are helping with accounting. We help all of our schools work in QuickBooks Online, so we're able to support them, train them in QuickBooks. We also help a lot on the operations side. So if a school is either just getting started or they come on board with us, we make sure they have a lot of the policies in place that they need to have for the state of Indiana. And so I developed a financial policy handbook that we kind of customize for all of our schools to make sure that it follows, their internal controls and their processes at the school level. And that policy and procedure manual is also in compliance with the SBOA. So we always consider their audit in mind, what their end goal is, what they need to be doing all year round to make sure they have a successful audit at the end of the fiscal year. So we're kind of like a third party for them. We help upload a lot of the financial reports, a lot of things that the auditors will ask for that the schools may not know, what it is that they need to provide. So we help kind of guide the audit and make sure everything goes smoothly on that front. We also help a lot with grants. So my role has kind of morphed into more of a director of grant services. So now we have a team that's dedicated to helping our schools with their grants, and that's state, federal, private. And so we kind of have set up a system and a process with our schools that we work alongside them and make sure that all of their grants are getting spent down and they're in compliance with those, and the reporting that goes along with that. We help process the reimbursements that have to take place because Indiana, as you know, is mainly reimbursement-based grant, however you want to say that. Like that's
environment, state, whatever you want to call it.
So a lot of some states give the money up front to
Right.
schools. Indiana is not like that. We have to reimburse for all of our grant funding. So we help with that process as well. So yeah, we do kind of a lot of things across the board, and we customize it based on what the needs are at the school.
Well, ending with grants was a perfect transition. Well done, because our topic today is grants. We're going to talk about grants. So Kim and I had the chance to meet, and we got into talking about the work that CIES does, and grant management comes up all the time as a thorn in the side, but also a really impactful and critical part of charter school operations and finance. And so that's what we wanted to talk about today. I'm really excited to dig into this. I know nothing about grants, so I'm going to ask lots of basic questions, but I wanted to start just kind of at the 30,000 foot view. Like, why are grants so critical to success?
Well, funding, right? Like all of the schools need grants to help support the programs that they're implementing at the school level. So grants help a school run. They help a school be successful and really do whatever the school's heart, soul, and mission is. It's a way to be able to do that. And so help support students and families in their communities.
Awesome. So grants are a critical source of funding. They oftentimes enable, to your point, unique programs or services that a school is looking to offer. Now, the challenging part with grants is obviously grant management, which is specifically what we're going to be talking about today. What are some of the things, before we get into the grant management framework, what are some of the things that you see or hear most often from schools that you all support when it comes to grant management that schools just are getting wrong or that you come across in regards to grant management?
Yeah, so I think this is really important. I think a lot of schools, I wouldn't necessarily, I don't want them to think they're doing anything wrong, right? They're focusing on the things that they need to focus on at the school. They're the ones on the front lines doing the work. And so I think what schools struggle with the most and find most challenging, I think, is knowing sometimes that they have grant funding, right? But then they're not thinking about it maybe every day because they're doing a million other things. There's special education, testing, so many different things that they're trying to be compliant with in regards to academics that I think that they're not always thinking about this particular grant and what are the requirements of this grant, and having those like progress monitoring throughout the year for each grant to make sure that they're on track to spend it down and that sort of thing. I think that schools are just so busy as they have so much on their plate that they have to do. I think that grants sometimes just become something that has to sit on the back burner because they've got a million other fires that they're fighting.
Right. Without the mechanics in place, it quickly becomes we know we need these grants, but we've got other front burner issues, and maybe the implications of that are not utilizing grant funds, or like what are some of the implications that you see of not really having systems or processes in place when it comes to grants?
Yeah, so a lot of times what we see is that grants become an afterthought, right? So like maybe they received a grant in July and they've looked at the award letter, they glanced at it, they see that they have a whole year to spend it down. So it's like, okay, I'm going to think about this in after the holidays, after Christmas break, I'm going to worry about this later. Then later comes and they look back at the grant, and maybe there's specific programs that had to be in place the whole year. Maybe there's certain benchmarks that they're supposed to be meeting. And now it's kind of too late to go back from July to December to do that. And so, like I said, I think it becomes sometimes an afterthought, or just honestly too, it not intentional, but just unaware of what the
Sure.
grant requires, right? Like it's just something that maybe they didn't even know. Oh, I'm supposed to be doing this specific thing for this grant. I had no idea. It just like not truly knowing the ins and outs of each grant and what the requirements are.
Got it. So you have a 5-part framework that we're going to talk about today for grant management. And before we jump into each of the components, I wanted to just quickly list off the 5 here. So we've got number 1, planning; number 2, budgeting; number 3, implementing; number 4, tracking; and number 5, reporting or reviewing. So those are the 5 components of the grant management framework. Now, before we jump into number 1, which is planning, I wanted to ask, as you think about this process or this framework for grant management, is this a continuous process where school should always be doing all 5 of these, or do these individual components map to like the academic calendar where there's a certain time of year? I was just curious to ask if the framework itself kind of follows a chronological flow, or if you really view this as these are the core components for grant management and are sort of continuous or ongoing.
That's a great question. I feel like for a lot of our schools and for a lot of the grants that they receive, this can be continuous, but based on the grant. I think there are some grants where you only have to think about these 5 components or this framework at a certain point in the year. And a lot of times that can happen when you're doing your overall budget for the school. But I think that with some of the grants, a lot of them, at least Indiana, don't follow the same fiscal year as our school's fiscal year.
Right.
And so you are having to kind of adjust for that a little bit. And so the timing of these can really just depend on, when you receive the grant or when you expect to receive the grant. And it can also depend on, is it state and federal? Is this something that you are going to have every single year? So, for example, we'll get into some of this a little bit, but like Title I, for example, we know we're going to have that, hopefully, fingers crossed, every year. And so with that grant, that should be something that's really, you should pretty much know your Title I grant and what's required of it and what's involved. And it's mostly going to be the same every year. Obviously, there's always changes going on. But you're going to have your pre-application due every July 1st. Your budget's going to come out. Your budget's going to be due at the end of August every year, right? So there's certain parts of different grants that are going to be the same. But then there's certain grants, I think, that like private grants, for example, those may be completely different and may require you to kind of think about these 5 framework pieces a little bit differently depending on when you receive those funds.
Okay, so there's some nuance involved. Totally makes sense. All right, so let's dive in. So part 1, planning. Talk us through, where do you recommend schools get started when it comes to planning for grants?
I think planning really starts with the schools thinking about their budget. I think that's really where all of that planning begins, because as you are thinking about your budget for next fiscal year. A lot of our schools plan their budget in the spring. So when you're sitting down with your leadership team or whomever, and you're thinking about your revenue for the following fiscal year, obviously your grants should be included in that revenue stream. So you should have a pretty good idea of historically for your school what to expect when it comes to grant revenue. The other thing that I think is important with planning is we separate all of our schools' grants by fiscal year. So the part that I think is important for the grant side of thing outside of the budget is to have some type of system. We use a Google Sheet. I know a lot of schools use Google, but we use a Google Sheet that we've developed. And it is a spreadsheet. It has tabs at the bottom for each grant. It has a summary page. It has a staffing list, all of those things. So I'll go into that a little bit more, but that particular spreadsheet really is our framework for how we think about what grants are we expecting to receive next fiscal year. So at the beginning of the fiscal year, we create a new spreadsheet for that school for that fiscal year, and we make sure we know what's expected to come so that it's on our radar. We have notes for every single tab. So I don't want to get into too much in the weeds, but I think having some type of system in place that allows you to really see everything in one shot at a glance, to be able to really look at your grants, what's expected for that fiscal year, breaking it down by fiscal year, I think is so, so important.
Totally makes sense. And I think in the weeds is great. Super helpful to hear how you all are tracking this. What about, you had mentioned earlier, private grants or, grant funds that maybe are a little more, I don't know what the right word is, maybe unexpected, maybe you applied
Yeah.
for them and they're a long shot, or maybe you've received private grant funds and you're not sure if that same foundation is going to give you the grant again. How do you factor that into the planning process?
Very conservatively. So when you are thinking about your budget and you don't know if you're going to receive these additional funds, that maybe it's a competitive grant that you've applied for, we are very conservative with our schools. So we're not going to add anything into the mix yet that we don't know is 100% expected for the school. Now, if you feel like for whatever reason, you have a pretty good idea that you are going to get the grant, maybe scale it back a little bit as to what you expect for revenue. Now, that's on the budgeting side. When you think about the spreadsheet and the planning side, this is what this spreadsheet is designed to do. And maybe there's another system out there that does this better. I have not found it. But when you apply for a grant, to keep that grant on your radar, add a tab on that spreadsheet. Add the information, add the budget that you submitted. And I know we're going to get into that, but add the award amount that you applied for. It doesn't mean that you have it yet, but it allows it to be something that you're like, oh, I applied for that back in July and it's September. I haven't heard anything. Okay, now's a great time for me to follow up with Department of Education on that and see where it's at in the process.
Right.
So just because you put it on your grant tracker, it doesn't mean that you've received it, but it puts it on your radar, on your staff's radar. What we also like to do is use color coding at the bottom of our spreadsheet. So anything that is red, we know that oh, hey, this grant we're needing something, it's pending, we're missing something. It allows us to bring our eyes to the red ones and look at those first and make sure there's nothing we can do on our end to get that grant tied up, basically.
Right. Do you have, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Do you have a version of that template that you'd be willing to share, or is it under lock and key?
No, I would love to. I think a lot of schools don't have the time to just, create something like this. So I would love to share it with whomever is listening.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So we'll link in the show notes Kim's epic grant management template.
I don't know about epic.
And if you're listening to this, or if you see the template and you find some other cool software, send it to Kim so she can check it out.
Yes, please.
All right. So we've got planning, and it sounds like the key takeaway here is really making sure that you have some system in place, whether it's Google Sheets, fancy software, pen and paper. There needs to be some place that you have visibility into all the grants that you're expecting, grants that you've applied for, like the bird's eye view into everything.
Yes,
Sounds like that's the critical component here of starting with planning.
absolutely.
Okay, so let's move on to budgeting. Today's episode is brought to you by CDW Education. CDW is a trusted technology partner to more than 15,000 K-12 schools, having deployed over 3 million Chromebooks into the classroom, with over 1,000 schools participating in their North American Google Technical Collaborative. Did you know that CDW Education's digital edtech team, a special team dedicated to serving the charter community, advises charter school leaders like yourself as you evaluate technology solutions and the positive impact they can have on the student and staff experience, as well as academic achievement. To learn more about the technology solutions CDW Education recommends, whether you're modernizing your classroom, protecting student data, improving internet connectivity, or even building an esports program from the ground up, you can email digitaledtech, that's all one word, digitaledtech, at cdw.com, and an edtech advisor from their team will follow up with you. Because planning and budgeting are obviously closely tied together. So budgeting is the second component of the framework. Let's talk a little bit about why budgeting can be tricky. You mentioned certain grants, maybe like Title I, can feel simple, or can feel like at face value we should expect this much grant revenue. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the ins and outs of budgeting for grants. Like, what is your typical recommended process here?
So I love talking about this part of it because maybe I'm just a big dork, but there's so much to think about when it comes to budgeting. But there are certain things you can do at the school level to make this a little bit easier. So one thing that I'm going to go back to this grant spreadsheet that I'm talking about, this template. One thing that we do with all of our schools, the very, very first thing you need to do at your school is get your staffing list updated, added to this spreadsheet, and on a tab so that you can clearly delineate, assign, label all of the staff that are in a grant. You need to make sure that not only you, but your team understands who is in a grant. A lot of our grants, we do have staffing. I mean, it's just there's certain positions that are allowable in a lot of these grants. And so the first thing we always start with is staffing. I mean, that is something that is easy to budget for the most part. And it's something that, if you have a school counselor, for example, and they decide to leave, most of the time you're going to still replace that person. So the name might change on the grant, but the position can stay the same. So when you think about budgeting, I mean, you should leverage your staff as much as possible, because any person or staff person that you are putting in a budget and getting funds back for, obviously there's rules that go into that, but you're getting that money back that otherwise you would just be using your general fund for. So it's helping offset any of those costs, and it's going to help your bottom line overall. Now, you asked a little bit about the rules and all that. Of course, there's going to be rules for each grant as to what's allowable and what's not. And so the number one error that we see with our schools is a lot of times schools will have somebody in a budget, in a grant budget, a position, and then this other person that's working on a grant, maybe the assistant principal or school leader, puts that same person in a new grant they're applying for and had no idea that, Sally Joe was in Title I, for example. So you need to have something that you share with all of your team so everyone knows who is in which grant. And so there's no, what's the word I'm thinking of? Like, there's no
double dipping.
Correct. There's no double dipping happening. And we've had in some cases where our schools applied for a grant. We work with them on their grants, but they applied, they submitted a budget, and they never told us about it. And then we're like a year later, hey, we can't use Sally Joe. She's in this other grant. So then it's a mess, so you need to have somewhere where it's very clear staffing wise who's in which grant. The other thing is you want to make sure you understand what's allowable in the budget and think of costs that you already have. I think a lot of schools, what they do is They try to create all these brand new expenses. And sometimes that's needed, right? Like sometimes there are rules where, you have to buy this particular curriculum or whatever it is. But if you think about the costs that you already have at your school and try to leverage those first, that's really going to help your overall budget. And that's also going to make it a lot easier when it comes to reimbursing these expenses or applying these expenses to those budgets. You're not going to have to create a bunch of extra work and order this brand new software or curriculum or furniture or, and obviously those things are needed from time to time, but trying to leverage your existing costs as much as possible, things you're going to have year after year consistently, will really help make your budgeting process go a lot better too.
What does that, I'm going to go into the weeds here.
Sure.
Practically, what does that look like? The staffing piece, your first recommendation, totally makes sense. You can list all your staff, who's in a grant, who's not in a grant. In looking at other operating expenses and trying to better understand or categorize existing costs to grant funds that could offset those costs, how does a school do that? Are you looking at the last 12 months and everything we bought under technology and then trying to compare that with technology infrastructure grants that the school applied for? Like practically, how does a school do that?
That's a good question. And it is going to differ based on what the grant allows. But ESSER, for example, a lot of schools across the country received millions of dollars in ESSER funds. And of course, there are requirements called MOE, which require you to meet certain thresholds for your spending each year in your general fund. So that's getting a little bit too much in the weeds maybe. But I say that to say a lot of our schools decided and were able to use custodial services, for example, in their grants. That is 1,000% a COVID-related expense.
Right.
Throughout the pandemic, schools had to make sure cleaning was like the highest priority. And so knowing that ESSER allowed for that and knowing that was an existing cost for our schools, that's something we included if we could. That includes custodial staff. That includes if you have a third-party custodial vendor. So if you use QuickBooks Online, for example, you can look back at your historical spending over the last year and you can kind of estimate, oh, hey, we used ABC Clean Company and they were about $12,000 a month. Let's put $12,000 a month in our grant budget and help absorb some of that cost that we know we're going to have regardless. And most of the time, schools ended up spending more on custodial because it was just more money to make sure everything was clean and more staff and that sort of thing. So a lot of our schools budgeted that amount and then went back and even some of them added more to that budgeted amount. So thinking about those kind of costs, custodial supplies, all of the schools are going to need custodial supplies. So including those in the grant. I mean, just those things that it's like, you're going to have regardless. Mm-hmm. Does that help answer the question or?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it sounds like it comes back to understanding the categories that qualify for the grant and then thinking thoroughly, I won't say creatively, but thoroughly about what existing, services, service providers, human capital, software, et cetera, fall into that category and not being afraid to allocate existing costs to those grants.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's move on to number 3. So we've got planning, we've got budgeting. Now we move to implementing. What does this step in the framework entail? What do you mean by implementing?
So implementing your grant is going to be taking a glance at what's going to be required for that grant and making sure you don't have what we talked about earlier in the show happen, where you go 6 months without thinking about it. So implementing, in my opinion, is taking some dedicated time to look at the grant, look at the requirements of the grant, make sure you understand your eligibility date for your expenses, your final reimbursement date. Thinking ahead proactively is kind of what I think of implementing. What do we need to do for this grant over the life of it? And let's put those things on our calendar so that we're thinking about it right now. 2 months from now, let's put some dedicated time on our calendar to circle back to this grant, make sure nothing has changed, make sure there's no budget amendments required, all of that. So just putting all of the dates, the more logistical items for the grant, making sure there's a process in place, understanding who's going to oversee that grant, understanding who's responsible for what, kind of delegating if needed, not just getting the grant and like, oh, okay, we're going to think about it later. No, let's like proactively make sure we understand who's in charge of this grant, who's the one taking the lead, who's the one following up with the staff, making sure the program is getting implemented, overseeing it, all of that. Being proactive and thinking about what's required.
Does that process that you just described of assigning ownership, calendaring, action steps, setting reminders, do you typically see that there's a single person that owns grants or grant management, and you're recommending that that person kind of own the implementation and make sure that people know if they're on the hook for this step in implementing the grant, that they have a reminder on their calendar, they're not missing deadlines, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think most schools are going to have one person, right, who kind of oversees all of the grants, make sure these steps are in place. What I've seen at a lot of our schools who are very successful with this, they'll have one person who's in charge of putting all of those things on their calendar, or they're the person that's going to say, okay, I know I'm going to handle this part of the grant, but for high ability, for example, we have a high ability program at the school. And so I know that Nicole Smith is going to oversee the program implementation portion, and I'm going to oversee the financial piece. So I feel like with most of our schools, there is like someone that's clearly in charge of overseeing them and making sure all of the pieces are in place for each particular grant. And then that person is responsible for putting that on their calendar, setting a reminder to talk to Nicole Smith about the high ability program and how it's going. And, if there's any supplies that are needed, or talking with her about the budget, because there's no way for, let's say, the grant person to know what's needed in the high ability program. She's not in the weeds every day. So there's no way for her to know the supplies that are needed and all of that. So getting some dedicated time with Nicole Smith to sit down, talk about the budget, what they've spent so far, what do you still need? Is there a change that needs to happen to the budget? Do you initially applied for this particular software and maybe you since then got some pretty negative feedback on it and you want to use something else, so does that require an amendment? And so making sure you're talking with the person that is in charge of the implementation process at the school.
Okay, I'm going to move us on now to number 4, which is tracking. So once grant funds are being used or they're in the process of being used, how do you encourage schools to keep track of remaining funds? And I recognize some of this is nuanced depending on the state you live in or how the funds are allocated. You mentioned, at the top of the discussion that in Indiana, it's reimbursement based. So how should schools be thinking about tracking?
So there's 2 main components when it comes to tracking for our schools. And I think this can apply in some way as well to however you're doing it in your state or in your school. But number 1, let's go back to this. I keep talking about this template, but that's almost our main number 1 way that we know what our budget is for each grant, what we've reimbursed or what we've spent, and how much is remaining, which is key. You cannot rely on your reimbursement form that you submitted to the state. You can't, because a lot of times that reimbursement form will have your expenses broken up into categories and everything is lumped together. So for example, if you have in your general supply category, you have $100,000 and within your budget, you have curriculum, classroom supplies, teacher supplies, all these different budget items, you want to make sure you know how much is remaining in each particular budget line. So you should not be using just your reimbursement form to track what's remaining for that grant. You need to have an internal system in some way, whether you use my sheet or not, create some type of internal system so that you know what's remaining in each grant for each budget item. The key is you want to make sure anyone who is new can look at your spreadsheet and clearly understand what happened in that grant, what happened in that reimbursement. You always have to be thinking about, I'm not the only person that's seeing this spreadsheet. There could be several different people seeing the spreadsheet. The auditors could be looking at this spreadsheet at some point. So whatever I'm putting on here, it needs to be clear what happened in each grant for expenses, reimbursements, etc.
And so let's just take both scenarios, whether or not a school gets funds upfront or reimburses, is the ensuring each expense is going to the correct grant and grant category. Is that happening, or are you recommending that schools do that on a monthly cadence? Is it before a purchase order is even created? Should you be tagging it to the proper grant? Like in the day-to-day, I guess is what I'm asking. In the day-to-day
Sure.
operation of the school, if I'm the IT director and I'm ordering Chromebooks or something like that,
Yeah.
how am I working in lockstep with my grant team? Because I know we have some funds that will cover the cost of these devices.
Yeah. And so that is actually the second component of your tracking. So your tracking should be done in some type of accounting software. I don't recommend just using, your paper receipts to track your expenses. You need to have some type of system that will allow you to classify and code by grant so that okay, I've used this expense already for Title I and it's been reimbursed. I cannot use it again in another grant. This also helps with double dipping, because if you clearly show, okay, these expenses are for Title I and they've been coded there, then they can't be used anywhere else. And that really helps with that process too. So we use, again, QuickBooks Online for all of our schools. We just use the classes to code and make sure everything is coded to the proper grant. And then we run that report for that grant when we're ready to do the reimbursement, for example, ensure that all the expenses are good to go and can be applied to the budget lines. And then that's what we call our schedule of expenses that we use to show, okay, these are all the things that we reimbursed.
Okay, so bringing us to a close here with component number 5, reporting and reviewing. How is this different from tracking? When you talk about reporting and reviewing, is this in regards to reporting back to the issuer of the grant? What does this type of a cadence look like? Is this an end of year exercise? Talk to us about this last step in the framework.
Yeah, so the reporting piece usually comes into play after you've done all of the things we've talked about. It's going to usually be like your final year-end report that's required. It's going to be that report that says, hey, this is what we budgeted, this is what we spent, these are how the programs that got implemented, here's the results, right? Here's the data. It's not just the financial piece, but it's this overall, here's our high ability program that we implemented, and we saw scores go from 50% to 75% for these students in ELA or math. It's not every report requires that much detail, but some of them do. And so you might have to, if you're the grant person at the school, you might have to work with whoever's in charge of that program to help finalize your year-end report or your final report for that grant.
And so if you're the grants manager, it seems like ensuring that you're not operating in a silo is really important, because I can just envision getting towards the end of the year and then you didn't meet with the chief academic officer who launched the high ability program or something like that. And then you're looking for all this data that either doesn't exist or doesn't exist in a format that's easily digestible and reportable. And so making sure that there's alignment on what the reporting requirements, it seems like that's an important starting place as well as ending place. As you think about reporting, is most reporting pretty manageable as long as you know that it's coming?
I think it's pretty manageable. Yeah. And like I said, too, you can have help from your team and your staff to finish these reports. If you're the person who handles your grants, you should not be expected to know all the ins and outs of every single program that's being implemented with every grant, So working as a team, having clear communication, having those progress meetings every other month on your calendar with that person, and really holding to those meetings, making sure something didn't come up and now we can't have the meeting. That happens, but make sure to reschedule then, make sure you're having those points and they're not just getting pushed off to the back burner.
And I'm going to venture a guess that the type of reporting is also in the spreadsheet. Is that correct?
Not always. So
okay.
With our spreadsheet with Indiana, what we do for our schools is we do include links to the compliance, if there is a compliance website for a grant, like Title I, for example.
Right, the .gov or whatever.
Yeah, it has a lot of resources. And so we'll plug in that link. That way, if there's ever a question, like the school can easily go to that link and look and see, oh, okay, here's these components I need to make sure I'm implementing. So having all the resources there when you're working on implementing a grant, like put it all there. That way, when you go back to it, you're not searching a million different places for it.
Well, Kim, this was a very enlightening conversation, and I really appreciate you walking us through your framework for grant management. And I already mentioned we'll put your template in the show notes, but if people would like to learn more about CIES, or if they want to connect with you, where should we point them? Where should they go?
Oh, great question. So you can always feel free to email me anytime. I'm happy to help answer questions or give resources if I have them. You don't have to be one of our clients, and I can tell you my email address, and it's a pretty long one. I don't know who is in charge of the domain, but we should definitely get it updated. But my email is kim@innovativeedsolutions.org. Innovative with a V, edsolutions.org.
Well, at least the front end is easy. It's just Kim. Yeah. It makes up for the second half. Awesome. All right. Well, any other last kind of external resources related to grants or grant management that you found helpful, or other things that we should point people to?
Network. Make friends with people in other schools, because a lot of times they may know something you don't. And you can, if you have a friend like, hey, do you know where I'm supposed to get this? Or do you know what this is? A lot of times that will help a lot with, as you're learning and managing and trying to make sure you're doing all of the things with grants. Have some friends that you can rely on to network with.
Really good advice. All right. Well, Kim, thanks so much for coming on. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Charter School Insider. This show is brought to you by BuyQ, the group purchasing organization specifically for charter schools. Want to learn how to maximize your school's purchasing power? Join together with thousands of other charter schools by visiting buyq.org/sign-up. BuyQ's purchasing program is free and has no obligations or commitments required. If you enjoyed today's episode, do us a favor and subscribe on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you have a question or feedback for us, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at podcast@buyq.org. Thanks, and we hope you'll tune in for the next one.